She stood beside the altar, dressed in humiliation, watching another woman claim her future, until the Duke raised his hand and stopped the vows. He was supposed to marry the golden bride before him. Instead, his gaze found the woman everyone had forgotten. What truth did he recognize that wealth had tried to bury? Hello, friend. If this moment has caught your breath the way it caught hers, I'd be deeply grateful for your support. A like, a subscribe, anything that tells me you're here for stories where quiet dignity defeats loud cruelty. And if you'd like, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're reading from. I treasure every single one. The church smelled of beeswax and white roses, their perfume so thick it seemed to coat Mabel Lambert's throat as she stood in the shadow of the stone column. The stained glass windows threw fractured rainbows across the polished floor, each shard of colored light trembling with the weight of held breath. 200 guests filled the pews, silk rustling, jewels catching the afternoon sun streaming through the lancet windows. Not one of them was looking at her. Mabel's gloved hands were folded at her waist, fingers pressed together until the seams bit into her skin through the thin fabric. She had chosen the dove-gray dress deliberately, muted, modest, nearly invisible against the church's stone. Her hair was pinned simply beneath a small hat with no adornment. She had made herself as small as possible, a courtesy to those who had made it clear she no longer mattered. At the altar, Rebecca Smith stood radiant in cream silk that seemed to glow against the dark wood of the chancel. The dress had cost more than Mabel's family earned in a year. Everyone knew it, and Rebecca wore that knowledge like a crown. Her veil was Brussels lace, her bouquet a cascade of hothouse lilies that must have been imported at extraordinary expense. She was a vision of everything a duchess should be. Beautiful, polished, and most importantly, wealthy. Duke Jones, Lawrence, stood facing her, his back to the congregation, shoulders square in his dark mourning coat. From where Mabel stood, too far to be family, too close to escape notice, she could see only the line of his jaw, the slight tension in his posture. He had not looked at her once since she'd entered the church. She hadn't expected him to. The priest's voice droned through the liturgy, Latin phrases that had sealed countless unions in this very spot for centuries. Mabel found herself counting the candles along the altar rail, 12 on each side, their flames perfectly still in the windless air. She focused on small things, the cool smoothness of the column against her shoulder, the faint creak of the pew as Lady Ashworth shifted her considerable weight, the way the light moved across the floor as clouds passed beyond the windows. Anything to avoid thinking about how she'd once believed she would be the one standing at that altar. The memory rose unbidden, sharp and unwelcome. A winter afternoon 5 years ago in her family's library, smaller and shabbier than this cathedral but warm with firelight. She'd been 17, ink-stained and earnest, explaining her thoughts on Wollstonecraft's Vindication to a young man who had actually listened. Not just pretended to listen while planning what to say next, but truly heard her, asked questions that sharpened her thinking rather than dismissed it. "You notice things others don't?" Duke Lawrence had said that day, his grey eyes serious. "That's rare. Don't let anyone convince you to stop." She'd carried those words like a talisman through the years that followed, through every quiet assumption that one day she would be his wife. It had never been announced, never formalized, but everyone had known. The Lamberts and the Lawrences had an understanding. Mabel had grown up in the certainty of it, the way one grows up certain the sun will rise. Until Rebecca Smith arrived. With her father's fortune and her mother's ambition, and certainty became a childish fantasy Mabel was gently told to outgrow. "These things change, my dear," her own mother had explained, eyes averted. "The Duke has responsibilities now. He needs what Miss Smith can provide. Surely you understand." Mabel had understood. She'd understood perfectly. Now she stood in the shadows of his wedding, watching understanding become reality, watching another woman receive what had once been promised, or at least what she'd believed had been promised. Perhaps that was the cruelest part, being told her entire belief had been mistaken from the start. The priest's voice shifted, rising slightly in pitch as he reached the critical moment. The congregation stirred, a collective intake of breath. This was what they'd come for, the binding words, the irrevocable commitment. Mabel's hands tightened against each other until her fingers went numb. And then, Duke Jones, Lawrence raised his hand. Not to take Rebecca's. Not to place the ring. He raised it palm out, a gesture of stopping, of negation. The church froze. Every whisper died, every rustle of fabric ceased. Even the candle flames seemed to still, as if the very air had forgotten how to move. I cannot proceed. His voice carried through the silence, clear and steady and utterly without apology. And then, slowly, so slowly that Mabel felt time stretch and bend around the movement, the Duke turned. Not toward the congregation, not toward the priest. He turned toward the stone column where Mabel Lambert stood, dressed in grey, forgotten by everyone except the one man who mattered. His eyes found hers across the width of the chancel, across the chasm of wealth and expectation and broken assumptions. And in that moment, Mabel understood that she had been wrong about one thing. He had been looking at her. He had never stopped. The understanding between the Lamberts and the Lawrences had never required words. It existed in the space between tea services and estate visits, in the way Mabel's mother would smile knowingly when the Duke's carriage appeared on the drive, in the careful way her father spoke of future arrangements without ever naming them aloud. It had begun when Mabel was 14, all elbows and earnestness, more comfortable with books than ballrooms. The Lawrence estate bordered theirs to the east, close enough that smoke from their chimneys mingled on cold mornings. Duke Jones Lawrence, newly titled after his father's sudden passing, had visited that first autumn with the stiff formality of a young man carrying responsibilities too heavy for his age. He was 22 then, grey-eyed and serious, speaking in careful sentences about land management and tenant welfare. The adults had conducted their business in the drawing room while Mabel remained in the library, grateful to be forgotten, until he'd found her there. Locke's essay, he'd observed, nodding toward the book in her lap, not asking what a girl was doing reading philosophy, simply acknowledging what she was reading, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That conversation about empiricism and innate ideas and whether experience truly shaped understanding had lasted 2 hours. When it ended, something unspoken had shifted between the families. The visits became regular, spring and autumn, sometimes summer. Always proper, always chaperoned, but always with moments when Jones would seek out the library, the garden, the quiet corners where Mabel existed outside the performance of femininity her mother occasionally attempted to impose. They discussed Hume's skepticism, the implications of Adam Smith's moral sentiments, whether Burke's sublime could be rationally analyzed or only felt. He never complimented her appearance, never recited poetry or brought flowers. Instead, he brought questions that sharpened her thinking, challenged her conclusions, treated her mind as something worthy of engagement rather than indulgence. "You see patterns others miss," he had said once, during a debate about justice and natural law. That clarity matters. Mabel had built her future on such moments. Not on promises, but on the steady accumulation of attention that felt more permanent than any vow. While other girls her age learned to blush on command and laugh at tedious jokes, while they practiced the art of strategic silence and calculated charm, Mabel remained herself. Thoughtful, direct, occasionally too honest for comfort. She had believed it was enough. Believed that constancy of character mattered more than theatrical displays of desirability. She'd never asked for confirmation, never demanded declarations, and that she would later understand. had been her mistake, because unspoken understandings require everyone to remember the same story. And when fortune changes the value of players, even the clearest understanding can be rewritten as if it had never existed at all. The shift began with a letter delivered on heavy cream paper, sealed with the Prime Minister's crest. Mabel had been reading in the morning room when her father emerged from his study, face flushed with an excitement she hadn't seen in years. "The Duke has been appointed to the cabinet," he'd announced to no one in particular. "Trade and colonial affairs, extraordinary for someone his age." Within a fortnight, everything changed. Invitations arrived daily at the Lawrence estate. Not the polite country calls that had marked their social calendar before, but summons from London's most influential families. The Duke's name appeared in the Morning Post alongside ministers and magnates. His opinion was suddenly sought on matters of national importance. Land acquisitions that had been merely prosperous became politically significant. Jones Lawrence was no longer simply a young duke managing his inheritance. He had become valuable. Mabel noticed the change in her own drawing room first. When the Duke visited that spring, later than usual, his stay shorter, her mother's voice carried a new brittleness. Her father's laughter came too quickly, too eager. They spoke of opportunities and connections and what might be possible with the right alignments. The conversations no longer included her. "Perhaps we should let the Duke rest before dinner," her mother suggested when Mabel moved toward the library where Jones waited. "He has so many demands on his time now. We mustn't be presumptuous." Presumptuous. The word landed like a stone in still water. The next visit, her father used different words. "We must be practical about these things, Mabel. His position requires certain considerations now. Timing matters." Practical. Timing. Considerations. Mabel began to understand that she was being prepared for something, though no one would name it directly. The letters from Jones became less frequent. Not absent. He still wrote, still asked about her reading, still engaged her thoughts, but the intervals stretched. When he did visit, there were always others present now. Stewards, secretaries, men discussing parliamentary matters in voices that made it clear her presence was an interruption rather than an expectation. She caught her parents exchanging glances across the dinner table, saw her mother's hands twist in her lap when the Duke's future was mentioned. They had begun speaking in careful euphemisms, in sentences that trailed into weighted silence. "Things change," her father said one evening, not quite meeting her eyes. "When circumstances shift, one must be flexible, reasonable." Mabel had nodded, understanding perfectly what he couldn't say. She was becoming inconvenient, and inconvenient things, she was learning, were easily set aside when necessity demanded it. Rebecca Smith arrived in late summer with 6 trunks, a lady's maid who spoke French, and a dowry, substantial enough to be discussed in exact figures rather than vague assurances. Mabel first saw her at the Harrisons' garden party, standing beneath the elm trees in a gown of pale blue silk that caught the light like water. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, polished, deliberate, designed for maximum effect. Golden hair arranged in fashionable curls, posture that suggested years of deportment training, a smile that knew precisely when to appear and when to withdraw. The shipping magnate's daughter, Lady Harrison whispered to Mabel's mother, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for discussing enormous wealth. 30,000 a year, they say, and her father's considering a parliamentary seat. Mabel watched Rebecca move through the gathering with the confidence of someone who understood her own value and expected others to recognize it as well. She was not flirtatious. She was strategic. When she spoke to the Duke, which she did within the hour, there was no blushing or giggling. Only intelligent questions about trade policy and colonial expansion, delivered with the certainty of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "She's perfect for him," Mabel's mother murmured. given his position now? The connections alone. Within 3 weeks, the Smiths had been invited to dine at the Lawrence estate. Within 6, Rebecca's name appeared in every conversation about the Duke's future. The Lambert family was invited for tea on a grey October afternoon. Mabel knew before arriving what would be said. She recognized the careful arrangement of chairs, the way her mother's hands trembled slightly as they removed their gloves. Her father delivered the news in the same study where he'd once spoken of future arrangements with such certainty. "There was never an official engagement, Mabel," he said gently. "You must understand that. An understanding, yes, between families, but circumstances have changed. The Duke's position requires, well, Miss Smith brings advantages that are simply necessary now." Necessary. There was that word again. "You've been so patient," her mother added, eyes bright with tears that somehow made Mabel feel she was the one causing pain. "So gracious through all of this. We're grateful for your understanding." Her father cleared his throat. "The wedding is planned for December, at St. Catherine's. Naturally, we'll all be invited. It would mean a great deal if you would attend." Mabel heard herself say something appropriate, saw herself smile, felt herself nod, and understood, finally, that she had been erased as thoroughly as if she'd never existed at all. If this moment hurts, it should. And if you're still here feeling it with her, you already belong among us. Subscribe now, or explain in the comments why you're choosing to walk away. Duke Jones. Lawrence stood at the window of his study, watching rain trace patterns down the glass, and said nothing. He had been saying nothing for months now. It had started as observation, a desire to see how quickly convenience could rewrite history. He'd watched his steward dismiss the Lambert understanding as youthful imprecision, watched his mother speak of more suitable arrangements as if Mabel had been a passing consideration rather than 5 years of deliberate choice. Watched society reshape his intentions without ever asking what they had been. No one had asked. They had simply assumed his silence meant consent. "Miss Smith will make an excellent duchess," his mother had declared over breakfast one morning, as if the matter were already settled. Her father's connections to the shipping industry alone. Jones had continued reading his correspondence, neither agreeing nor objecting. The wedding plans had accelerated around his silence like water flowing around stone. He attended the dinners he was expected to attend, accepted the congratulations offered by men who saw Rebecca Smith's dowry as proof of his good judgment, stood beside her at social functions where she discussed colonial trade with impressive precision and no warmth whatsoever. She was intelligent, efficient. She understood marriage as a merger of assets and influence, approached it with the same competence she might bring to reviewing a contract. There was nothing objectionable about her. There was also nothing that made him want to spend the rest of his life in her company. "You're very quiet about all this," Rebecca had observed during one of their chaperoned walks. Not accusatory, merely factual, as if noting a curiosity. "Do you always let others plan your life?" "I'm watching what happens when I do," he'd replied. She'd smiled at that, appreciating the intellectual exercise if not understanding its stakes. What Jones was watching, specifically, was Mabel Lambert. He'd seen her at the garden party where Rebecca had been introduced, standing near the rose arbor in a dress 2 seasons old. Had watched her face as her mother whispered urgently in her ear. Had observed the exact moment she'd understood what was coming and the careful way she'd composed herself before anyone else could notice. No tears, no dramatic proclamations, no appeals to sentiment or history. Just quiet dignity in the face of public erasure. He'd received one letter from her afterward, brief, formal, congratulating him on his engagement and wishing him well. The handwriting had been steady. Not a single word suggested bitterness or betrayal. It was, Jones reflected, exactly what he should have expected from someone who had never demanded anything from him, not promises, not declarations, not even the basic courtesy of being consulted about her own future. The wedding was 3 weeks away. Everyone assumed his silence meant acceptance. They were wrong. The invitation arrived on ivory cardstock, engraved with the Duke's crest and Miss Rebecca Smith's family seal intertwined. Mabel held it between her fingers, feeling the weight of expensive paper, and understood it for what it was, proof that her erasure was complete. She was to be a witness to her own replacement. Her mother had suggested the lavender silk with the Belgian lace. "You should look your best, darling. Everyone will be watching." Mabel chose grey instead. Dove grey, simple cut, no embellishment. She would not compete where she had already lost, would not perform dignity she didn't feel. If she must attend, she would do so as honestly as possible, visible enough to fulfill social obligation, unremarkable enough to be quickly forgotten. "You're being very gracious about all this," Lady Harrison remarked at the dressmakers, her tone suggesting she'd expected theatrical suffering instead. Not every young woman would be so understanding. Understanding. They kept using that word as if Mabel's silence indicated approval rather than the simple absence of alternatives. What they called grace was actually the mathematics of powerlessness. She could rage against the rewriting of 5 years of her life, or she could preserve what remained of her dignity. Those were the only choices. Society's cruelty, Mabel was learning, lived in its politeness, in the careful way people thanked her for understanding what they'd never explained, in the gentle voices that made her erasure sound like kindness, in the assumption that because she didn't weep publicly, she must not be wounded privately. "The Duke is so fortunate," another acquaintance offered. "Miss Smith brings such advantages. I'm sure you see that." Mabel saw it perfectly, saw that advantages measured in thousands of pounds would always outweigh advantages measured in years of intellectual companionship, saw that she had been naive to believe constancy mattered more than calculation. She had spent weeks trying to locate the exact moment everything changed, searching for the conversation or decision that had severed what she'd believed unbreakable. But there had been no moment, just a slow erosion of assumption, her future disappearing like morning mist while everyone pretended nothing was being lost. The night before the wedding, Mabel sat at her writing desk and acknowledged a truth she'd been avoiding. She had been erased, but not broken, cast aside, but not destroyed. And for the first time in months, she chose not to hope. Hope required believing the world might still surprise her with fairness. Mabel had learned better. Tomorrow she would attend the wedding, watch Rebecca Smith become the Duchess she'd once expected to be, and then she would begin the work of building a life from what remained after expectation died. St. Catherine's Cathedral had been transformed into a monument to wealth and expectation. White roses cascaded from every surface, the altar rail, the window ledges, the ends of pews reserved for families of significance. Candlelight flickered from silver, candelabras tall enough to cast shadows across the vaulted ceiling. The air was thick with beeswax and imported perfume, heavy enough to feel against the skin. 200 guests filled the stone sanctuary, silk rustling like whispered judgments. Mabel recognized most of them. Members of Parliament, shipping magnates, society matrons whose approval could make or break a season. They had come to witness power aligning with power, wealth blessing wealth. She stood beside the third column from the altar, positioned precisely where she could be seen, but not heard. Close enough that her absence would have been noted, far enough that her presence could be easily ignored. The placement had not been accidental. Rebecca Smith entered to a collective intake of breath. Her gown was cream silk that seemed to glow in the candlelight, the train so long it required 2 attendants. Brussels lace veiled her face, but her confidence was visible in every measured step. She moved like someone accustomed to being watched, to being wanted, to being chosen. Mabel's hands tightened in her grey gloves. Duke Jones Lawrence stood at the altar, his back to the congregation. From her position, Mabel could see only the rigid line of his shoulders, the careful stillness of his posture. He had not turned when Rebecca entered, had not acknowledged the collective murmur of approval. The priest began the liturgy in Latin that rolled through the cathedral like distant thunder. Each phrase felt interminable, stretched across time that refused to pass. Mabel counted candle flames, traced the patterns in the stained glass, focused on anything except the reality unfolding before her. She was watching herself disappear. In moments, Jones would speak vows that made Rebecca his duchess. In months, Mabel would be a footnote in family histories, the girl who'd mistaken kindness for commitment. In years, she would be forgotten entirely, a minor character in someone else's story of triumphs. The priest's voice shifted, rising toward the binding questions. Mabel felt her breath catch, held suspended in her chest. This was the moment, the irrevocable instant when expectation became permanence. She prepared to let go of everything she'd believed about her future, her worth, her... The Duke raised his hand. This is the moment most people abandon the story. But if you leave now, you'll miss the truth. Subscribe before the world changes, or stay silent like everyone else. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical presence, pressing against eardrums and lungs, suffocating in its completeness. Every whisper died, every rustle of fabric ceased, even the candle flames seemed to still, as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. Duke Jones, Lawrence's hand remained raised, palm out, fingers steady, a gesture of negation that stopped time itself. "I cannot proceed." His voice carried through the cathedral with devastating clarity. Not loud, but absolute. The voice of a man who had measured his words carefully and found them sufficient. The priest froze mid-phrase, his book of common prayer trembling in his hands. Rebecca Smith stood motionless behind her veil, a statue carved from cream silk and shattered expectation. "Your Grace," the priest managed, voice cracking, "perhaps you need a moment. I need nothing but honesty." Jones turned, slowly, deliberately. "Which requires me to acknowledge a truth I have allowed others to obscure." He was not looking at Rebecca. Mabel felt his gaze find her across the width of the chancel, across the chasm of wealth and assumption and carefully constructed lies. Her breath stopped. The cathedral tilted. "For 5 years," Jones continued, his words measured and inexorable, "I have known a woman who asked nothing of me except that I think clearly, who valued truth over performance, who built her life on constancy while I allowed mine to be rebuilt by convenience." Gasps rippled through the pews like wind across water. "Miss Smith," he said, finally turning toward his almost bride, "you deserve a husband who chooses you with intention, not one who accepts you through inertia. You deserve more than to be the practical solution to someone else's political advancement." Rebecca stood perfectly still. Then, with extraordinary composure, she lifted her veil. Her face was not angry. It was knowing. "You're right," she said quietly. "I do." She turned and walked down the aisle, her train whispering against stone, her spine straight. Not fleeing, departing. There was a difference. Jones faced the congregation, 200 faces frozen in shock. "I will not marry for rescue," he declared. "Not of fortune, not of reputation, not of political convenience. I will marry, if I marry, for recognition of what has always been true, even when I lacked the courage to defend it." He stepped away from the altar, walked past pews of speechless aristocracy, stopped before the stone column where Mabel Lambert stood, dressed in grey, hands clasped so tightly her fingers had gone numb. "I have been silent when I should have spoken," he said, voice lower now, meant only for her. "I have watched when I should have acted. But I will not stand at that altar and compound cowardice with cruelty." He extended his hand. "If you will still have me, Mabel Lambert, I'm asking now. not through family understanding or social expectation. I'm asking you." The cathedral emptied with surprising restraint. No stampede of scandal seekers, no theatrical declarations. Just the quiet exodus of people who understood they had witnessed something that would be discussed in drawing rooms for years, but need not be dissected immediately in a house of worship. Rebecca Smith departed with her family, her head high, her dignity intact. As she passed Mabel, she paused for the briefest moment. "He saw you," she said quietly. "I don't think he ever stopped." Then she was gone, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of what might have been. The priest had retreated to the vestry. The remaining guests filtered out in clusters, their whispers rising only once they crossed the threshold into afternoon light. Within minutes, the cathedral stood nearly empty, candlelight flickering across abandoned pews. Mabel remained by the stone column, Jones's hand still extended between them. She looked at it, at him, and felt the weight of 5 years pressing against this single moment. "You stopped a wedding," she said finally, voice steadier than she'd expected. "In front of 200 witnesses. For me." "I stopped a lie," he corrected. "The witnesses were incidental. They won't be incidental to the consequences." "No," he agreed. "They won't." He lowered his hand slightly, though he did not withdraw it. "I'm not asking you to rescue my reputation, Mabel. I'm asking if you still want what was promised, not by our families, but by 5 years of conversations that mattered more than I admitted, even to myself." Mabel felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope. She had trained herself away from that. Something harder, more complicated. The recognition that after months of powerlessness, the final choice was hers alone. "You let them rewrite our history," she said. "You stayed silent while I was erased." "I did. No justification, no excuse. I told myself I was observing, testing whether truth could survive convenience. I was wrong and cruel." "Yes," she said simply, "you were. I cannot undo those months, but I can stand here now and acknowledge what I should have defended then. You were never a misunderstanding to be corrected. You were a choice I made years ago and lacked the courage to claim publicly until it nearly cost me everything." Mabel looked past him to the altar, to the roses and candles arranged for someone else's triumph. Looked at the space, where she had stood invisible, insignificant, cast aside. Being silent had not made her disappear. Being forgotten had not made her worthless. And being chosen now, finally, publicly, irrevocably, did not erase what had come before. But it did restore something she'd believed lost, the power to decide what came next. She looked back at Jones, at his extended hand, at the question written across his face. And for the first time in months, Mabel Lambert chose hope. Not because it was easy, because it was hers to choose. "Yes," she said, "dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.